Frank Sinatra was halfway through I've Got You Under My Skin when he saw the gun. Not pointed at him, not yet, just resting on the table in front of a man in the front row. A man whose name you whispered in Las Vegas, never spoke out loud. Frank stopped singing. The band kept playing for a few bars before trailing off into confused silence. The audience held its breath. And then Frank Sinatra did something that would either make him untouchable or get him killed. He walked straight toward the mobster and asked him what the hell he wanted. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Las Vegas in 1960. It wasn't the family-friendly tourist destination it is today. It was a city owned and operated by organized crime. Every casino, every hotel, every show, everything ran through the mob, and everyone knew it. The Sands Hotel, where Frank Sinatra was part owner and performed regularly, was partially controlled by crime families from Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. Frank himself had complicated relationships with these men. Some were friends, some were business associates, some were people you tolerated because refusing them wasn't an option. The Rat Pack, Frank, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, they all knew the rules. You performed, you entertained, you kept your mouth shut, and you never, ever crossed the men who really ran the town. But Frank Sinatra had never been good at following rules. He built his career on doing things his way, singing the songs he wanted to sing, making the movies he wanted to make, living his life exactly how he chose to live it. That independence had made him a star, but it had also made him enemies. And in Las Vegas in 1960, having the wrong enemies could get you killed. The trouble started 4 days earlier, October 12, 1960. Frank was in his suite at the Sands going over arrangements for his upcoming shows. He was in a good mood. His career was flying high. The Rat Pack was selling out every show. His album, Nice and Easy, was climbing the charts. Everything was working. There was a knock at the door. His assistant, a young man named Joey, opened it. Standing in the hallway was a man in an expensive dark suit. Joey recognized him immediately. His face went pale. "Mr. Sinatra," the man said, not waiting for an invitation. "Mr. Marcello would like to speak with you, tonight, after your show, in private." Frank looked up from his sheet music. He knew who Mr. Marcello was. Everyone in Vegas knew who Carlos Marcello was. Carlos Marcello ran organized crime in New Orleans and had significant influence in Las Vegas. He was one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. When Carlos Marcello wanted to meet with you, you met with him. No questions asked. But Frank Sinatra had dealt with mob bosses before. He'd known them since his days in Hoboken. He'd partied with them, performed for them, even borrowed money from them when his career was struggling in the early 50s. He understood how this world worked, and he understood that the moment you showed weakness, the moment you came running when they snapped their fingers, you were owned. "Tell Mr. Marcello I appreciate the invitation," Frank said calmly, "but I'm pretty tired after shows these days. Maybe we can grab dinner sometime next week when I'm not so busy." The messenger's expression didn't change. "Mr. Marcello insists." Frank put down his sheet music and stood up. He walked over to the door and looked the man directly in the eyes. "Listen to me very carefully. I don't work for Carlos Marcello. I work for myself. If he wants to talk to me, he can call me himself and ask nicely, like a civilized person. You got that?" The man stared at Frank for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll deliver your message." After he left, Joey was shaking. "Frank, do you know who that was? That was one of Marcello's guys."
"You can't just blow him off like that."
Frank shrugged and went back to his music. "I can, and I did. Nobody owns Frank Sinatra. Not the studios, not the labels, and definitely not Carlos Marcello." Joey tried to explain. Carlos Marcello wasn't just connected to organized crime. He was one of the most feared bosses in the country. He controlled gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking across the South. Louisiana, Texas, parts of Florida, all his territory. He had politicians in his pocket, judges, police chiefs, senators. In 1960, Attorney General Robert Kennedy was actively trying to deport Marcello. It wasn't working. Marcello had too much power, too many connections. He'd been arrested multiple times but never convicted of anything serious. The FBI considered him one of the most powerful mobsters in America. When Carlos Marcello wanted something, he got
got it, and when he didn't get it, people disappeared. But Frank wasn't interested in hearing any of this. He'd been dealing with powerful men his whole life. Growing up in Hoboken, the mob was just part of the neighborhood. They ran the docks, the bars, the gambling. Frank's uncle had connections. His early career was helped by men with connections. When Frank's career collapsed in the early 1950s, voice gone, no movies, no records, it was mob-connected figures who helped him get the role in From Here to Eternity, the role that saved his career. Frank knew he owed them, but owing them and being owned by them were two different things. Frank had always maintained a careful balance. He'd do favors, perform at private parties, look the other way when needed, but he never let them control him, never let them dictate his career, his life, his choices. That independence had served him well, but it also made him unpredictable, dangerous even, because a man who won't be controlled is a man you can't trust, and in the mob world, trust was everything. So when Frank refused Carlos Marcello's invitation, not once, not twice,
but 3 times, it wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. It suggested that Frank Sinatra thought he was above the rules that governed everyone else, and maybe he did. The next night, October 13th, Frank performed his usual show at the Sands. Afterwards, the same messenger appeared at his dressing room. "Mr. Marcello is waiting downstairs. He'd like to speak with you now." Frank was taking off his tuxedo jacket. "Tell Mr. Marcello I already left for the night." "But Mr. Sinatra, you're right here." Frank smiled. "Am I? Could have sworn I left 10 minutes ago." The messenger's jaw tightened. "Mr. Sinatra, I don't think you understand the situation." "No, pal," Frank interrupted. "I understand perfectly. I understand that I just worked my ass off for 2 hours. I understand that I'm tired, and I understand that I'm going to my room to have a drink and go to sleep. Now you can stand there and argue with me, or you can deliver my message. Your choice." The messenger left without another word. Joey was beside himself. "Frank, you're playing with fire. You need to talk to someone. Maybe Sam Giancana. He knows Marcello. He could smooth this over." But Frank refused. "I'm not getting Sam involved. This is between me and Marcello, and I'm not meeting with some guy who thinks he can order me around like I'm one of his employees." On October 14th, word started spreading around the Sands that Carlos Marcello was angry, very angry. Casino staff who had connections to the mob quietly warned Frank's people that he needed to make peace, but Frank still refused. That evening, his manager, Herman Citron, came to his dressing room looking terrified. "Frank, I'm begging you, just take the meeting. 5 minutes, that's all." "What does he want?" Frank asked. Herman hesitated. "I'm not entirely sure, but I heard it has something to do with Cuba." Frank's expression darkened. "Cuba? Marcello has business interests there, or he did before Castro. Apparently, He thinks you have connections in the Kennedy camp. He wants you to help get his casinos back." Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't have connections with Kennedy, not anymore. Jack won't even take my calls since he got elected." It was true. Frank had campaigned hard for John F. Kennedy in 1960. He'd organized fundraisers, performed at rallies, introduced JFK to Hollywood celebrities and, yes, to mob figures like Sam Giancana. Frank had believed Kennedy would be different, a friend to Frank and his associates. But after the election, Kennedy had distanced himself from Frank. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was launching an aggressive campaign against organized crime, and Frank, with his mob connections, had become a political liability. It stung. Frank had delivered votes, had delivered money, had delivered connections, and Kennedy had thrown him away like yesterday's garbage. "It doesn't matter if it's true or not," Herman said desperately. "Marcello believes you can help him. Just meet with him. Tell him you'll try. Buy yourself some time." But Frank was stubborn. "I'm not apologizing for something I can't do. If Carlos Marcello has a problem with me, he can bring it up like a man, not through messengers and threats." Herman left shaking his head. He knew Frank well enough to know that once his mind was made up, there was no changing it. October 15th, 1960, the day everything came to a head. Frank arrived at the Sands around 7 p.m. for his 10 p.m. show. The atmosphere was tense. Staff members were whispering. Security seemed more alert than usual. Something was happening. At 9:30 p.m., Joey came to Frank's dressing room looking terrified. "Frank, you need to cancel tonight's show." "Why would I do that?" "Carlos Marcello bought out the first 5 rows. Him and about 30 of his guys. They're out there right now." Frank didn't even look up from adjusting his bow tie. "So they paid for tickets." That makes them audience members like anybody else. "Frank, this isn't a joke. They're not here to watch you sing." Frank turned to face Joey. "Then I guess I better put on a hell of a show." At 10 p.m., Frank Sinatra walked onto the stage of the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel. The room was packed, every seat filled, but the atmosphere was wrong. There was tension in the air that you could cut with a knife. Frank looked out at the audience and immediately saw them. The first 5 rows, filled with men in dark suits, and in the center of the front row, directly in front of the stage, stage sat Carlos Marcello. He was a heavy-set man with a round face and cold, calculating eyes. He looked like a businessman, a successful one, but everyone who knew anything about Las Vegas knew better. Carlos Marcello was one of the most dangerous men in America. Frank smiled at the audience. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Sands. We've got a great show for you tonight." He nodded to the band. They started playing "I've Got You Under My Skin." Frank sang, moving around the stage with his usual confident grace, but his eyes kept drifting back to Carlos Marcello. The mobster wasn't clapping, wasn't smiling, just sitting there, staring. Frank finished the first song. The audience applauded enthusiastically, except for the first 5 rows. They sat in silence. "Thank you," Frank said into the microphone. "You're too kind. Although I notice some of you in the front seem a little quiet tonight. Don't worry, I won't take it personally." A few nervous laughs from the audience. The men in the front rows didn't react. Frank moved into his next song, "The Lady is a Tramp." About halfway through, Carlos Marcello reached into his jacket. Frank saw the movement. His voice faltered for just a second, but Marcello wasn't pulling out a gun. He was pulling out a cigar. He lit it slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off Frank. Then Marcello did something that made the entire room uncomfortable. He made a gesture, a simple gesture, but one that was unmistakable. He drew his finger slowly across his throat. Frank saw it. The band saw it. People at nearby tables saw it. A murmur went through the crowd. Frank stopped singing. The band continued for a few more bars before trailing off into silence. Frank stood at center stage, looking directly at Carlos Marcello. The room was completely silent. 1,500 people holding their breath. And then Frank did something nobody expected. He smiled. "Folks, we're going to take a little break from the program. See, there's a gentleman in the front row who seems to have something on his mind. And you know me, I'm all about communication." He started walking toward the front of the stage. The audience tensed. Carlos Marcello sat perfectly still, but his eyes narrowed. Frank reached the edge of the stage and looked down at the mobster. "Mr. Marcello, I've been getting your messages, all 3 of them, and I gotta be honest with you. I don't appreciate the way you've been going about this." The room was dead silent. Frank continued, "See, I'm a simple guy. You want to talk to me? Call me. Ask nicely. We'll grab a drink. We'll talk like civilized people. But you send messengers? You make threats? You come to my show and do that?" Frank mimicked the throat-cutting gesture. "That's not how you treat Frank Sinatra." Carlos Marcello's face was expressionless, but everyone who knew him knew this was the most dangerous moment. This was when he decided whether to kill you or not. The silence stretched on, and then Marcello spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent room. "You got balls, Sinatra. I'll give you that." Frank shrugged. "I've been told that before. You know who I am?" "Yeah, I know who you are, and you know who I am. So let's cut the tough guy act and talk like adults." Marcello stared at Frank for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, but it was a smile. "All right, Frank, you want to talk? Let's talk. After the show, you and me, alone." Frank nodded. "Fine, but here's the deal. You come to my dressing room, not some back office, not some warehouse, my dressing room, and you come alone. No guys with guns standing outside the door." Marcello's smile widened. "You don't trust me?" "I don't trust anybody," Frank said. "That's why I'm still alive." Marcello laughed. Actually laughed. "All right, Frank. Your dressing room. After the show. Just you and me." Frank stood back up. "Great. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a show to finish." He walked back to center stage, picked up the microphone, and said to the audience, "Ladies and gentlemen, that was Carlos Marcello. Let's give him a round of applause for being such a good sport." The audience, still confused about what was happening, applauded nervously. Marcello raised his glass in a mock toast. Frank launched back into his performance. For the next hour, he sang and joked as if nothing had happened. Marcello and his men stayed for the entire show, and when it was over, they applauded along with everyone else. After the show, Frank was in his dressing room when there was a knock. Joey opened it. Carlos Marcello stood there, alone. "Can I come in?" Frank nodded. "You want a drink?" "Yeah, Jack Daniels if you got it." Frank poured 2 glasses. They stood there, not saying anything. Finally, Marcello spoke. "You know why I wanted to meet with you? Something about Cuba?" Marcello nodded. "I had 3
3 casinos in Havana. Beautiful places. Made millions. Then Castro comes in, nationalizes everything, takes it all. Just like that. And you think I can get them back for you? I think you know people who might help. Frank took a sip of his drink. I don't know those people anymore. Kennedy won't take my calls. Bobby Kennedy wants to put guys like you, and guys like me, apparently, in prison.
I can't help you. Marcello was quiet for a moment. You're telling me the truth.
Yeah, I'm telling you the truth. I wish I could help, but I can't. Marcello studied Frank's face. Then he nodded. All right, I believe you. Just like that? Just like that. See, Frank, I've been doing this a long time. I know when somebody's lying to me, and you're not lying. You really can't help. So what now? Marcello finished his drink. Now? Nothing. We're good. We're good. Yeah, you stood up to me. You didn't run, didn't hide, didn't send someone else to deal with me. You looked me in the eye and told me no. I respect that. Frank was genuinely surprised. That's it? That's it. But Frank, next time I send someone to talk to you, maybe don't make them come 3 times. Bad for their ego. Frank smiled. Deal. Marcello extended his hand. Frank shook it, and just like that, it was over. What happened that night at the Sands spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew. Frank Sinatra had stood up to Carlos Marcello and survived. More than survived. He'd earned the mobster's respect. The incident changed something fundamental. Before that night, the mob viewed entertainers as employees, useful, but ultimately expendable. But Frank had shown that a performer with enough courage could command respect even from the most dangerous men. Dean Martin heard about it and called Frank the next day. Are you out of your mind? Do you know what Marcello could have done? He could have done a lot of things, but he didn't. Why didn't you just meet with him the first time? Frank thought about it. Because the moment I went running when he snapped his fingers, I'd spend the rest of my life running. These guys respect strength, Dean. You show weakness, they own you. So I didn't show weakness. Dean laughed. You crazy bastard. Over the years, the story grew into legend. Different versions emerged. Some said Frank had pulled out a gun.
Others said Marcello had come on stage. None were true. The truth was simpler. Frank Sinatra had faced down one of the most powerful mob bosses in America with nothing but his voice and his courage. Carlos Marcello and Frank maintained a respectful distance after that night. They'd occasionally see each other around Vegas and would nod in acknowledgement. In 1963, Marcello was implicated in various investigations. By the 1980s, he was facing serious legal trouble. But he never forgot that night at the Sands. When asked about Frank Sinatra years later, Marcello was quoted as saying, "Frank's all right. He's got balls. I respect that." Frank, when asked about that night, always downplayed it. People make too much of it. I just didn't want some guy in the front row ruining my show. But those who were there knew better. They'd seen something rare, a moment when courage turned a potentially deadly situation into mutual respect. Frank Sinatra built his career on doing things his way. But that night at the Sands, he proved it wasn't just an act. He really was that brave. He really was that stubborn. And he really was that untouchable. The confrontation with Carlos Marcello became part of Sinatra lore, a reminder that Frank Sinatra didn't bow to anyone. Not studio executives, not record labels, not presidents, and definitely not mob bosses. In the end, that's what made Frank Sinatra a legend. Not just his talent, not just his charisma, but his absolute refusal to be owned by anyone. His willingness to look the most dangerous men in America in the eye and say no. Most people who crossed Carlos Marcello ended up dead or disappeared. But Frank Sinatra crossed him and walked away not just alive, but respected. That night at the Sands became a turning point. After that, the mob in Las Vegas treated Frank differently. Not as an employee, not as a tool, but as an equal. Someone who commanded respect through sheer force of will. Frank Sinatra was the chairman of the board.
The voice, the legend. And on October 15th, 1960, he proved exactly why no one, not studio heads, not presidents, not mob bosses, could ever own him. He did it his way, always.